represents attempts to frame the format of Normandy Summit, which comprises Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany, as a kind of the only real framework for the settlement in Ukraine. This is a complete upending of all the logic of diplomatic efforts deployed in this regard from the very beginning. Normandy summits do not substitute Minsk framework and are only aimed at reviewing progress made between Kyiv, Donetsk, and Lugansk. This becomes crystal clear if we turn to the decisions of the last Normandy summit, which took place in Paris on December 9, 2019. The President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, President of France, Emmanuel Macron, the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, issued a document called Common Agreed Conclusions. What has been achieved a year since, we will learn from our briefers. We wanted a representative from the Ukrainian government to participate in this meeting today as a briefer. I sent a letter to the permanent representative of Ukraine requesting him to facilitate this. The letter remains unanswered till today. We are particularly appalled by the efforts of our German and French colleagues, the Normandy participants, to boycott this meeting under ridiculous pretext that the format of the meeting does not fall under Normandy format. Moreover, we know that they worked tirelessly with delegations to dissuade them from participating. Not only this is shameful, but it also goes contrary to the established Security Council practice, whereby Arria Formula meetings are not blocked or sabotaged, whatever the subject is. As you see, they were partly successful. Our Western colleagues chose to ignore it. We have a question: why they are so scared to listen or talk to the people who represent Donbass? They are people, after all, and they at least deserve to be heard. Why they deny them their legitimate right to speak out? They don't want, as they tell us, to upstage Donetsk and Lugansk. And I would like to tell you that the representatives that you see here today are the ones who negotiate on behalf of Donetsk and Lugansk in the Minsk contact group. We also have Mr. Mikhail Pogrebinsky, a politologist from Kyiv. What was wrong listening to him? What's his fault? Our colleagues even insisted that the meeting should not be broadcast through the UN Web TV, as other Arria Formula meetings. It simply reflects their fear to hear the truth about what's really happening in Donbass. They would prefer to shut the mouths of its residents. But instead, we have our YouTube streaming today, about which we informed the general public. By the way, it's not the first time when our colleagues do it in the Council in such a way. On October 30, 2018, delegations of France, Netherlands, Peru, Poland, Sweden, UK, and US blocked participation of a representative of an electoral body in Lugansk, Ms. Yelena Kravchenko, despite the fact that the meeting was convened to discuss the ongoing electoral process. As you see, the truth is not a welcome commodity with these states. What happened today compromises the role of Berlin and Paris as intermediaries in solving Ukrainian crisis. They look more how to cover up Kyiv authorities instead. That raises questions as to the expediency of future Normandy summits without the implementation of their provisions and the Minsk agreements by all parties. They do not seem to have any value added. With this presentation, I am pleased to introduce our panelists, Ms. Natalia Nikonorova and Mr. Vladislav Deinega, representatives of Donetsk and Lugansk, or rather Lugansk and Donetsk, regions of Donbass in the Minsk contact group, as well as Mr. Mikhail Pogrebinsky, Director of Kyiv Center of Political Studies and Conflictology. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Natalia Nikonorova.
Greetings, dear participants of today's meeting. First of all, I would like to pay special attention and express my deepest gratitude to the delegations from more than 10 countries who take part in today's meeting. Thus, it is fair to say that all attempts of certain states to sabotage this event are failed. For me, as a plenipotentiary of Donetsk People's Republic in Minsk negotiations, it is of a high honor and importance to give a report on the real situation in Donbass and at the Minsk talks. I would like to continue. I would like, first of all, to thank you for this opportunity, and I would like to continue my briefing in Russian in order to provide you with more precise and detailed information. The simultaneous translation is provided by the Russian mission to the UN Security Council, what we highly appreciate. Еще раз добрый день всем участникам. Хочу еще раз подчеркнуть важность и нашу благодарность за возможность донести нашу точку зрения на все события, которые сегодня происходят в Донбассе, и те события, которые происходят в переговорном процессе в Минске. Эта встреча действительно очень важна для нас, поскольку она дает нам возможность донести нашу точку зрения второй стороны конфликта Донецкой и Луганской народных республик. При этом хочу отметить, что все, что мы будем сегодня озвучивать, мы готовы подтвердить конкретными фактами и аргументами. Мы готовы ответить на любой вопрос. Хочу вкратце остановиться на истоках конфликта. Я думаю, все участники сегодняшней встречи в той или иной мере ознакомлены с тем, что происходило в Киеве в феврале 2014 года, но я думаю, не все знают, что же происходило в это время в Донецке и в Луганске. После переворота, который произошел в 2014 году, в феврале, естественно, люди в Донецкой области и в Луганской области были возмущены, были напуганы, могу сказать это откровенно. Но в тот момент, что удивительно и что интересно, никто не призывал отделяться от Украины или идти, например, на Киев войной. На самом деле в Донецке люди собирались на митинги и обращались к своим представителям местной власти, к депутатам Донецкого областного совета, чтобы они выступили как их, действительно, как их представители и защитили их права, то есть обратились непосредственно к представителям киевской новой власти с неким воззванием, с неким заявлением о том, каким образом хотят жить, на каком языке хотят говорить и какие права нуждаются в защите людей Донбасса. Но, тем не менее, украинские новые власти начали свой путь с таких шагов, которые еще больше напугали население Донбасса. То есть первый же законопроект...
The population of Donbass even more. The very first draft law that was voted by the Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine was the law that banned free usage of the Russian language. Besides, after the position was expressed about non-acceptance of what was going on in eastern regions of Ukraine, with the help of nationalist and radical elements of the society, the Ukrainian authorities started a blatant massacre and cleansing of all who disagreed. These are events in Odessa on 2nd of May, 3rd of May in Slaviansk, 9th of May in Mariupol. According to official statistics in Odessa, about 48 people died, at least 250 were injured. On 9th of May in Mariupol, more than 20 people died. On the 3rd of May, during the storm of Slaviansk, more than 30 peaceful citizens died. All those events could not calm down the population of Donbass. On the contrary, they instilled fear and alarm. After that, the population was actually asked about how they saw their future, and the decision was made to hold a referendum. Another point, the local council, the full local council, in fact, fled the Donetsk region, so people had no one to turn to proclaim this referendum and to convene it. There was the total lack of state power because there was no single legal representative from the point of view of Ukrainian authorities. Nevertheless, there was such referendum. The turnout is self-explanatory. It is about 75% of the population. Out of them, 90%, to be exact, 89.7% voted in favor of independence. This shows the degree to which people were not able to accept what was going on in Ukraine. I'd like to mention that Ukrainian Constitution is a direct action act, and its Article 38 says that people have a right to take part in state affairs during all Ukrainian and local referendums. However, Ukraine still has no law about local referendums and the order of their convening, which means that this direct action act of the constitution is in fact blocked by the effective legislation. However, the people of Donbas used this direct action act, Article 38 of the Ukrainian constitution. And the very same right is indicated in the UN Charter, as a matter of fact. In response to such actions, the Kyiv authorities waged a full-fledged war on the population of Donbas. The so-called anti-terrorist operation that was aimed against the population of Donbas has been in effect for 7 years by now. Later, it was renamed as Joint Forces Operation, but it doesn't change its matter. The military forces of Ukraine are used against the people of Donbas. Since then, no less than 13,000 people in Donbas died, out of them 149 children. Just think of it, those were children who could take no part in any armed action. They've just killed. 80% of those 13,000 people were the victims according to UN human rights, and those victims were on our side. Those were people who died from the shelling of Ukrainian armed forces. Against that background, we had nothing else to do but to protect ourselves, to protect our land, to protect the people of Donbas, and to respond to this undeclared yet effective war. We were at home, we had nowhere to go. We had to defend ourselves. So we responded in a way that Ukrainian armed forces were turned back in cauldrons under Ilovartseva, Izmailova, and Debaltseva. In that situation, we were not very willing to sign the Minsk agreements and the package of measures because we were in a strong position from the point of view of armed conflict. And people's support was very strong. However, thanks to the mediation institution, our leaders were convinced that continuation of conflict and of armed confrontation meant more victims. That is why we signed the package of measures. We agreed with the rules and principles enshrined in the Minsk agreements. And now I'd like to go over to the main topic of this meeting, namely implementation of the Minsk agreements and the implementation of final provisions of the Paris Normandy Summit last year in December. Since the Minsk agreements were agreed, it has been 6 years, but I must say that not a single provision of those documents has been implemented in full. Let me make a point about the provisions that provide a clear demonstration of what has not been implemented and why. Let us start with point 1 of the outcomes of the Paris summit, namely the immediate measures to stabilize the situation in conflict zones. This is the security bloc. Full and comprehensive implementation of ceasefire, as provided for in the first paragraph of this clause, was not completed and has not been completed yet. So what is the story of the attempt to implement this clause in the Minsk group? We, as plenipotentiary representatives of the second side of the conflict, starting from May 2018, 6 times sent our proposals, our drafts on full and comprehensive ceasefire. Those proposals contained concrete steps that were to be observed in order to maintain ceasefire, to maintain it by both sides of conflict, by armed formations on the both sides. However, Kiev gave us no official reply, no written reply at all. And in words, they simply refused to discuss or negotiate anything and just ignored our proposals. However, in 2019, in July, on the 17th of July, we negotiated the so-called indefinite truce. This truce contained those measures, those steps to preserve the ceasefire, but it was adopted in a declarative mode, orally. That is why Kiev did not feel compelled to observe those provisions. Since then, we have taken 3 more written attempts to put our obligations down in writing. And this contains an interesting moment that each side has to adopt a decree on the ceasefire and to make it public. We suggested signing this, but Ukraine refused on the pretext that such a decree would constitute a classified information, a state secret. We noticed such a peculiar feature of Ukrainian side. Any decisions negotiated by Ukraine are negotiated precisely at the point when eminent political events are happening in Ukraine, for example, election campaign, or the moment when President Zelensky needs a meeting in Normandy format. This was the case with agreeing on indefinite truce in July 2019, before parliamentary elections, and negotiating of Steinmeier formula before the meeting of Normandy format, and actually the signing of the measures that we have proposed for 2 years. This happened before the local elections, at the moment when there was a local election campaign. On the 22nd of July, we finally signed this document with additional measures. And in the first 2 months after the signing, it was really calm. There were no people killed or injured. No civil infrastructure was destroyed. So we can say that the ceasefire was effective for some time. However, local elections came to their end, and we started to observe the following events. One of the additional measures says that no side should make steps to advance the other side, which means that no new constructions must be engineered, no new trenches, no new dugouts. We pointed out that we see this activity on the Ukrainian side in Shumy settlement, and in order to implement a joint inspection, which is a measure provided for in the document that we signed, to implement this measure, we proposed to the Ukrainian side to inspect this Shumy settlement in order to verify whether new trenches and new dugouts really had been constructed or not. However, the Ukrainian side toppled this joint inspection several hours before this inspection. It provided renewed demands for some documents that could not physically be met within the remaining hours before the planned inspection. And after that, the Ukrainian side refused to implement this clause at all. They said they did not understand the essence of this clause and the way it should be implemented. So this clause is not effective today, which actually makes all measures to preserve the ceasefire null and void, because without this clause, all those measures are purely declarative. They do not then have an opportunity to be verified whether there was any violation or not. It is not surprising for us that after those events, there were more and more violations. 157 violations have been made by now. There have occurred more victims among the civil population, a young man and his 69-year-old grandfather, who on the 12th of November were shell-shocked in Alexandrovka settlement. Also, our military servicemen are dying. I would not go deep into detail on that, but I would like to outline the methods that Ukrainian armed forces are using. They are somehow similar to methods that ISIL militants use. They drop grenades and explosive devices from UAVs. So they tie an explosive up to a drone and then drop it on our settlements or populated areas. A commander of our battalion died at the moment when he was trying to evacuate a dead body of his fellow soldier from the battlefield. He was killed by a sniper shot. So these are the methods that armed forces of Ukraine employ. So the measures that were taken to contain them are not working. Let me also make a point about the political aspect, which is no less important, probably even more important in terms of long-term settlement of the conflict. During the Paris summit, the sides agreed that in Minsk, the sides will have to negotiate and finalize all aspects of Donbas legal status. Unfortunately, we did not even get down to this. Let me give you an example that has to do with Steinmeier formula and its introduction to Ukrainian legislation. After on the 10th of October 2016, the formula was adopted and there were instructions and recommendations from the Normandy format to negotiate it at the Minsk platform. Right after that, this point was a priority issue at the agenda. However, during many dozens of meetings, during 67 meetings, the Ukrainian side blocked the discussion of this issue, which is for 2 years and 11 months, Ukraine was blocking this issue. And only on the 1st of October 2019, when there was a need for another summit, the Ukrainian side finally signed this document and negotiated, consolidated this formula that had already been agreed in the Normandy format. You can make sure of that by going to Verkhovna Rada website and looking through the legislation. Steinmeier formula has still not been implemented in the special status law. It is not there, despite the fact that it has been adopted 4 or 5 times already. So we do not see even attempts to have dialogue, to attempt a dialogue on the part of Ukraine, even though this dialogue is directly prescribed in the package of measures, the document that was endorsed by the UN Security Council. On the contrary, the Ukrainian side, by adopting decrees, that run counter to the Minsk agreements and to the package of measures. Such decrees are about 60 in number. I could actually list them, but I think you have an opportunity to get yourself familiarized with them in the report that we hope the Russian mission will share with all the participants of this meeting. But I assure you that those decrees do not only run counter to the Minsk agreement, but they violate such rights as the right to life, to health and safe living conditions, right to liberty and security of person, right to freedom of movement, right to a fair trial, right to an effective remedy, right to the inviolability of home, right to private property, right to freedom of economic activity. Here I could basically list almost all political, basic, civil rights, cultural rights of people that are violated by those decrees. Let me make a special point about recent draft law of Ukraine, draft law on internment, a very interesting one, which, without any right to appeal, stipulates that the General Staff of Ukraine Armed Forces will take a decision about internment of citizens to some specified locations. The draft law presented by the Ukrainian side as a plan of action to implement the Minsk agreements by 78% contradicts those very Minsk agreements, because it totally rewrites the order of implementation of the agreements. Out of 51 paragraphs, 40 run counter to the package of measures. So the negotiations process remains blocked. I have outlined two areas, political and security areas, where not a single step was taken to make a decision.
On the contrary, we constantly hear from Zelensky and his team about Plan B, Plan C, some other ideas. And judging by the aggressive rhetoric of those statements, we're talking not about peaceful intentions of Kiev. Zelensky stated that on the 9th of December of 2020 is the end of the term during which the Ukraine supposedly follows the Minsk agreements, which means Ukraine right now is a step away from the official refusal of the peaceful plan approved by the UN Security Council. And in this regard, we have a question. Will there be a reaction, a response from you, dear members of the UN Security Council, to such official denial of Ukraine to implement the above-mentioned plan? Today, our meeting is about the results of our activity and our actions a year after Paris Summit. Ukraine has implemented none of the paragraphs of the agreed conclusions. So despite all our proposals of their implementation, the representatives of Kiev simply refuse to accept them, to work with them, to comment them in any sort or make any remarks. And with such refusal of the second party, the dialogue is impossible. It's just same as clapping with one hand. It's impossible to do. It's impossible to settle the conflict without dialogue. With all that said, the situation in the peaceful negotiation process is critical. We think that the Security Council has the right and all the necessary leverages to call Ukraine for responsibility and to answer for their action. We don't want escalation, although we know how to protect themselves. We want peace and prosperity for Donbass. We want for it to develop the social economic potential, for the rights to be observed, for the freedoms to be observed, for all our political and civil rights to be observed, taking account all the values that are stipulated in the international tool. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Natalia Nikanora for her briefing, and now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Vladislav Deinegov.
Уважаемые участники встречи,
Dear representatives, participants of the meeting, first of all, I would like to thank you for the possibility to represent the position of Luhansk at such a high-level forum. And I would like to separately thank the delegation of the states at the UN that, despite the active counteraction, are present here with us. My colleague from the Next gave the description of the current state of affairs in rather detail, and with your permission, I would like to give a bit more detail about some particularities of the situation in our region. In 2014, after a counter-terrorist operation, so-called terrorist operation, they started to form punitive brigades and place them to Donbas. On the 15th of April, bright example, at the entrance to Lugansk, local citizens with their bare hands stopped the colonnades of military equipment, vehicles with the guns, D-30, which came from Dnipropetrovsk. And all this military equipment was thrown by Kiev and to be used against the unarmed civilians. Another example, in April 2014, in the cities of Luhansk region, everywhere citizens were arrested just for the bare fact that they acted and they were speaking against Maidan and the military coup. Against such backdrop, on the 27th of April 2014, during people's meetings, we initiated the establishment of the Luhansk People's Republic. And for that, we decided to hold on the 11th of May 2014 an all-people referendum on the territory of Luhansk region, asking whether the people would approve the state independence of Luhansk People's Republic. Moreover, the Presidium of the Luhansk Regional Council of the sixth season, not like their colleagues from Donetsk region, so far did not flee anywhere. And in May, they even adopted a declaration in support of this referendum. For the self-determination of the Luhansk People's Republic, voted over 96% of people who voted. On the 12th of May, at the meeting in Luhansk, we stated the results of the referendum and declared the act of the state independence of Luhansk People's Republic. And after that, in direct vote in the cities and the regions, we elected deputies of the People's Council of the LPR. And then we started forming people armaments in order to support civil order that were formed spontaneously. And meanwhile, in Ukraine, on the 25th of May 2014, on the unlawful snap elections, Petro Poroshenko won, who positioned himself as the president of the world and promised to end the conflict in Donbas within 2 weeks. And instead of that, instead of the peace that was promised, pretty much straight after the elections, the armed groups of Ukraine started first fights on the territory of LPR against civilians who formed into groups of self-defense. But Ukraine sent National Guard to fight against them that were formed from the activists of Maidan and also punitive battalions that were composed of felons who were released preemptively after they promised to wage a war against Donbas. Those armed groups were supported by aviation, tanks, artillery, and missile systems of Ukraine. One of the first and especially hard airstrikes was the shelling of the center of Lugansk on the 2nd of July 2014 by unmanned missiles. 2 of such missiles hit the building of a local administration. At that point, I was inside of the building, about 15 meters away from where the missile hit. couple other missiles of S-8 exploded in front of the building and in the park against it. And as a result, 8 civilians died, including 5 women. Later, 3 more people died from the injuries. 28 people were injured that were mostly in the street in front of the building. Among those killed and injured were my friends. Around 80 meters from where the missile exploded, there's a playground where at that point children were playing, but luckily none of them was injured. And the report of this crime on the evening of the 2nd of June was published at the website of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The use of heavy armament by the Ukrainian armed forces and aviation in the war against the population of Donbas became systematic. The aircraft were almost daily. On the 2nd of July 2014, Stanitsa of Lugansk, 12 people died, including a 5-year-old child. On 28th of August, the city of Alchevsk, 2 people were killed. At the same time, while the military action were taking place, the Ukraine was taking steps to suppress Donbass in economically and in humanitarian way. Ukraine started the economic isolation on the June 13th, 2014. And the work of state treasury bodies was suspended on the territory of Donbass. Payments of pensions were stopped, as well as social benefits, financing of the budgetary and communal sectors. Soon, decisions were made on the complete withdrawal of all the government structures, bodies, banks, and courts that will be withdrawn from the territories not controlled by Kiev. By the end of the summer 2014, the residents of the territories of Donbass, not controlled by Ukraine, were practically excluded from the legislative field of Ukraine. Since December 2016, Ukrainian radicals started blocking the transportation, and on the March 15th, by Poroshenko's decree, this blocking became legal. In addition, the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine established restrictions on the quantity of food that could be imported and the ban on the import of oil and lubricants. From April 25th of 2017, Ukraine stopped supplying power on the territory of LPR, leaving without power a number of large enterprises of Ukrainian jurisdiction that until then were working on our territory. So step by step, the Ukrainian authorities broke all the ties with Luhansk and Donetsk, gradually introducing a multifaceted embargo by water, transport, energy, economic. Parties take measures to set up a direct dialogue between Ukraine and Donbass. In September 2014, the protocol was signed. The protocol and the results of the consultations of trilateral contact group with respect to the joint steps aimed at the implementation of the peace plan of the President of Ukraine, Poroshenko, and the initiatives of the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin. This protocol provided an immediate bilateral ceasefire under OSCE monitoring and also a number of steps for political settlement of the conflict. The key of those steps are an inclusive national-wide dialogue, the release of all hostages and illegally detained persons, as well as the obligation of Ukraine to adopt 2 laws. One on the special order of local self-government in separate regions of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, law on special status, and the other one, the prevention of prosecution and punishment of persons in connection with the events that took place in certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk of Ukraine. However, Ukraine is dragging on with the implementation of its obligation, and in the period from December 2014 to January 2015 is avoiding dialogue. And on the dates that were agreed beforehand, me and Denis Pushilin, who at the time represented the DPR at the Minsk negotiation, as well as the representative OCE and Russian delegations, 5 or 6 times returned from Minsk without having any response and giving up on waiting on the Ukrainian delegation. As a result, the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreements designed to intensify the efforts of the settlement process was signed only on February 12, 2015, after an impetus given to Ukraine at the ceremony of the Normandy Quartet that took place in Minsk on February 11th and 12th. After signing this document, even then, when the peace process was determined, and it was determined that it would be completed before the end of 2015, only a few provisions in the security sphere were implemented, and only partially. As a result of the change of political power, the process of peaceful settlement has not speeded up. The current president, Zelensky, mostly follows the same principle of protracting the process, avoiding direct dialogue with Donbas, while faking active aspiration and intention to achieve a result. At the same time, Ukraine ignores the fact that the package of measures from the moment when the UN Security Council declared its support for it, and when its text was included as an annex to the resolution 2202, requires the level of the international law, and in accordance with Article 25 of the UN Charter, is legally binding. Another the Paris summit of 2019 did not give a positive impetus to the settlement. In a year that passed since the summit took place, there is no result on any paragraph of the agreement conclusion. The ceasefire was agreed even before the summit took place, from the 21st of July 2019, but nevertheless, it was impossible, and it is still impossible, to fully implement it. The decision that was made on July 22nd, 2020 on additional measures to ensure was subsequently disavowed by Ukraine, who refused to agree on joint inspection within the framework of the coordination mechanism. The plane of humanitarian demining and the potential areas for the second phase of disengagement of troops were jointly negotiated by Donbas in Ukraine. They were also agreed, but then blocked by the normative legal acts of Ukraine. They are in direct opposition to the Minsk agreements and create legislative obstacles for Ukraine to fulfill its obligation. At the same time, according to the practice of disengagement of troops in Stanitsa Luhanska, clearly points to the fact that Ukraine is not ready to implement the framework decisions of September 21st, 2016. And by this decision, for the first phase of disengagement, there were 3 areas that were identified, and 2 of which were successfully disengaged within the agreed time frame in October 2016. And the disengagement of troops in the remaining area in Stanitsa Luhanska was blocked in Ukraine for 3 years. Ukraine also blocked the exchange of detainees. Paragraph 6 of the package of measures for the implementation of the Minsk agreement, as well as the paragraph 1st of the commonly agreed conclusions of the Paris summit of 2019, provide for release and exchange of conflict-related detainees on the basis of the principle all for all, starting with all identified for all identified. In the period after the summit, roughly we can say that 2 exchanges took place. However, until now, none of them were completed due to the Ukraine's failure to fulfill the so-called procedural clearing, which means the release of person transferred in exchange process would not be prosecuted in connection to the events in Donbass, as provided by the paragraph 6 of the protocol on September 5th, 2014, and the paragraph 5 of the package of measures. In addition, this provision is secured by the obligations signed on the 23rd of December 2019 and April 8, 2020 by the head of Ukrainian delegation, Leonid Kuchma. And without the fulfillment of this measure, those exchanges have not been completed. Moreover, the discussion of potential new steps of the exchanges are not clear because it's unclear when they would be implemented with the state of current legislature in Ukraine. Opening of 2 additional checkpoints provided by the common conclusions was also disrupted by Ukraine. After the Paris summit, it took around 3 months for the contact group to negotiate the parameters of the 2 new checkpoints, Lugansk, Shasty, and Pervomaisk, Zolotoye, and also to negotiate a roadmap for a parallel preparation and their simultaneous opening. Further, there was another obstacle for the start of the construction in the form of obtaining security guarantees for the Ukrainian side for the entire period of construction. It took another 4 months to resolve this issue, and only in July we finally obtained such guarantees from Ukraine for the period from July 10th to November 10th. During the construction, Ukraine constantly evaded a joint approach and refused to come to the 0 point to agree on the technical details. As a result, after ignoring all attempts for concerted action, Ukraine inaugurated its checkpoint, announcing a change in their functional purpose. Shastia is just for pedestrians, and in the roadmap, it was approved for the passage of personal transport and trucks, primarily for humanitarian cargo. And Zolotoye was announced as a passage for transport, including freight, while in the roadmap it was agreed for pedestrians and personal transport. And such essential points as the work schedule, shuttle bus for delivering pedestrians in the gray area of Zolotoye, where the distance between the passport control points is more than 3 kilometers, and the specifics of work against the pandemics of coronavirus is still unresolved. And in order to achieve a compromise on this issue based on the humanitarian criteria, Ukraine showed itself not ready to do that. And as it turned out later, the necessary work on preparing the infrastructure of the checkpoints for the opening by the Ukrainian side was not completed. On November 29th, we received a request from the Ukrainian side to agree on security guarantees for the design work to repair the breach at the Luhansk-Shasty checkpoint. Thus, the assessment of the implementations of the results of the summit of 2019 is clear. There is a lack of political will that does not allow Ukraine to ensure the participation in Minsk negotiations in good faith and effectively organize the implementation of all the obligations it took. And I should note that on our side, we also face difficulties. During the Minsk negotiation, the republics had to make concessions, significant compromises. And in fact, the package of measures for the implementations of the Minsk agreements in itself is a maximum compromise for the Luhansk People Republic. And when I returned to the Republic after another round of negotiations where I stress that the LPR is ready to implement its obligations and I give proof of such intentions in practice, I face complete lack of understanding from our citizens. Why is it that when we see that Ukraine just blatantly demonstrates that it doesn't want to implement its obligations on the Minsk agreements, why we continue to implement them? And why do we try to get a similar constructive approach from Ukraine? Does Ukraine need Donbas if it pushes it away in all forms? With anxiety and fear, my compatriots ask me, will we go back to Ukraine? Will we have I can understand their fear, because in the past years, all our citizens saw our shelling of their homes, hospitals, daycare. They saw violence and aggression and torture, deprivation of their rights, deprivation of pensions and social guarantees. Thus, the purposeful systematic infringement of the rights of some of its own citizens by Ukraine, and their destruction in moral and in physical terms by shelling from heavy weapons and aviation, the economic isolation and deliberate deprivation of their basic humanitarian rights. How does it correlate with the goals enshrined in the UN Charter? And does the global community ignore the respect of the principle of equal rights and self-determination of the people that lays at the heart of friendly relations by the Part 2 of the Article 1 of the Charter? And the main question, is it time to dissipate and dispel all doubts and ask the people of Donbass themselves, do they need Ukraine? And does Ukraine need Donbass? Which during these years of civil war, and people during these years of civil war learned to live without Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Deinega for his briefing. Now, according to the logic, I would be willing to give the floor to the representatives of Kiev authorities. But as you know, they chose to ignore this meeting. They are now busy celebrating the victory over Russia in sabotaging it. And I would like to give the floor to a person who does not represent authorities, but he's from Kiev. He is the director of the Center for Political Studies and Conflictology, Mr. Mikhail Pogrebinsky. Mr. Pogrebinsky, you have the floor. Михаил Борисович, микрофон включите.
Please turn on your mic. Thank you to the organizers of this event. Thank you to all the delegations of the countries that took their time to take part in the meeting. I'm in a rather complicated position, as well as Vasily. I would consider it appropriate if now the official delegation of Ukraine took the floor, the representatives of the government and authorities took the floor, who would file the possibility to somehow present their vision. And the fact that I accepted the invitation to take part in this event is justified by the fact that I think that little is known about all the developments in the eastern Ukraine. Little is known by the global community in general. And since I studied in detail for a long time and monitored the events throughout this conflict, I think it would be useful to listen to some of my considerations. And at the same time, I have no intention to criticize all the speeches that I've just heard by the representatives of separate regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, as they called here unrecognized republics, as well as I cannot take responsibility to declare that I represent the position of Kiev. Moreover, I often criticize the authorities of Ukraine in the Kiev space. But here at the platform of the UN Security Council, I would like to explain why there are impasses in the settlement of the situation, and probably, and I hope so, it will give an impetus towards with the participation of the global community, including the representatives of the UN Security Council. We will have some impetus to move the process towards ending this slow-moving opposition and achieving a sustainable peace in my country. But I'll begin with the history of the conflict. I will not start with the beginning, but just about the Minsk process, because this process, the document, is a complex of 4 documents. 2 of those were adopted in September 2014. And the third, which is the package of measures that was approved by the UN Security Council and that became an international tool, that is called the package of measures on the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And of course, there's the 4th document, and these are the conclusions of the Paris summit, the anniversary of which we're celebrating or mentioning right now. Okay, can you hear me now? We can hear you very well. The key document is the package of measures, and it is this document that is the main obstacle and the reason of the impasse in the process of the settlement of the conflict. And in order to understand that, I would like to remind that it was adopted at the time, and Natalia mentioned the circumstances well when it was adopted. We have to understand the Ukrainian side, represented by Poroshenko, was at a critical, not even dramatic, but tragic situation when thousands of Ukrainian soldiers were in a very complicated situation, and there was a need, whatever it took to stop the military actions. And we signed this document, the package of measures, that, as it turned out right after its adoption, that the Ukrainian politicians were not okay with this document. They did not approve it. They criticized it, and there was a perception was formed that those obligations are impossible to implement.
I'm asked to reduce the volume. I'm not sure if I succeed, so I beg your pardon. Is it better now? I hope so. Yes, there is background noise. Is it better now? A little better, okay. I'm afraid I cannot do more. So, on the one side, this situation is as follows. On the one side, there is no willingness and no opportunity. Why there is no opportunity, I will explain later. There is no willingness to implement the package of measures by the previous authorities, I mean President Poroshenko, and the current authorities. The general reason is that such serious changes to the construction of Ukrainian state, which is envisaged by this package of measures. I mean, the inclusion of special status of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions in the constitution of Ukraine to anchor those obligations once and for good. And this encounters counteraction of large part of Ukrainian political elite, which makes it very difficult, even despite the fact that Zelensky came to power with a majority which started to degrade a couple of months later after the parliament started its work. This requires a special procedure and a vote by constitutional majority, and it required consolidated efforts of the entire political elite. This is why it is so hard to advance this process. If Ukrainian politicians believe that implementation of the agreement is impossible, then they probably could proclaim they could not implement it and that they wanted to withdraw. But the problem is that not only that this document is agreed by the Security Council, but also, and it is my private opinion, which does not correspond to the opinion of any representative of Ukrainian authority, I believe I understand that representatives of France, Germany, the United States are not interested. They are not interested in having Ukraine withdraw from the Minsk agreements because the very fact of readiness or consent or formal consent to implement it. Because formally Ukraine still says it is ready to implement the agreements. It was said that Ukraine is getting ready for a military solution, but the official position of Ukraine is that there is no military solution to the conflict in the east of Ukraine, and I hope that this reflects the real situation and the real sentiment in the corridors of Ukrainian political establishments. So getting back to why countries are not interested, I believe there is a direct link between sanctions against the Russian Federation with the implementation of the Minsk agreements. Because every time anti-Russian sanctions need to be prolonged, we hear words that Russia does not implement, without going deep into details if it's true or not, I am just describing the situation. There are words that Russia does not implement the Minsk agreements, that is why sanctions should be prolonged. And Ukraine, not only because there is a decision of the Security Council, but because it does not fall in today's interests of Ukraine, the position that corresponds to the position of their partners in the European Union and the United States, which is proved by quite a number of other examples. Now, is it all really hopeless? I listened carefully to what the representative of Luhansk said, and I understand his emotions. It is all perfectly understandable, but as a Ukrainian citizen, I would very much like for the Minsk agreements to be implemented, and implemented in a way that all sides are satisfied, have a compromise. And we have a Donbas that has received what it wants. What does it want? It is stipulated in the Minsk agreements, but not fully. And here, I'd like to pay attention to one detail. We study the way conflicts in various countries of the world are solved, and I can make the following remark here. I have a 3-page document called the package of measures. If I tried to show a document, for example, a document settling de facto military conflict in Mozambique. It also has about 3 pages with principles of settlement, but they are extended by 50 more pages that disclose in detail the sense of every paragraph and every sentence of those 3 pages. Unfortunately, by now, no such protocols have emerged here. They must have emerged by now, but it didn't happen. And when I say there is some hope, I always like to have some hope that this will end well. I think attempts to draft a roadmap on the implementation of the Minsk agreements, those attempts that recently have found a reflection in a particular document prepared by Donetsk and Luhansk on one side, and document presented by Leonid Kravchuk in the Trilateral Contact Group, the group that discusses ways of settlement. But unfortunately, those documents are incompatible yet. But I think that writing down the ideas of what every side wants will be a step forward on the path of a compromise. Let me underline. It is very difficult for the Ukrainian authorities to follow the path of compromise because of internal political disputes. By coming to power with 3/4 of population supporting him, President Zelensky and his team very soon could see for themselves that they were not able to follow the course that they had promised to their electors. They didn't have the right team, the passionate people who could support some hard-won compromise decisions. And in this situation, the Ukrainian authorities act under the pressure of external stakeholders. Ukraine seeks, and it has written it down in the constitution, membership in the European Union and NATO, so it is natural that Ukraine listens to external advice. To my mind, this advice often does not give the expected result, to put it mildly. In this situation, it is one form of pressure, and those external stakeholders have very different motivations. There are things they're interested in, there are things they're not interested in. Ms. Nikonorova mentioned the nationalist section that is ready to speak up against any, even quite little, compromise. What can we say about it? Ukraine faces a very complicated choice, especially in the economic, social situation and bacteriological situation because of COVID-19. So the situation in the country is quite hard, and politically it looks very unsustainable. There is much discontent of the population with the policy that Ukrainian authority is implementing. And to risk and to make any consent or any compromise to settle the conflict is very difficult for them, especially in a situation when our representatives who represent in the Normandy format on the part of Germany and France do not display willingness to push the sides towards a compromise. This creates almost a hopeless situation because the Ukrainian leadership, without Western support, without support of France, Germany, the United States, cannot go for any compromise decision to settle the crisis. And in fact, the fate of this crisis will be defined by whether this position can be changed, whether this position with regard to compromise can be changed. I hope that the new leadership of the United States of America will give us hope that we can expect any favorable environment in Euro-Atlantic relations, and that probably there will be some sort of a joint decision that will encourage Ukraine to look for compromise, which is held back on one part by radical circles, and on the other part, it is held back by our colleagues and Western partners who, I think, are the reason why the package of measures is the way it looks, with very much clauses that are hard to interpret. There is one clause which does not name Russia, but which means it. This clause says that there must be no help from the outside to the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. When signing this clause, everyone understood perfectly well what was meant, and everyone thought that Russia will stop helping and the task will be solved. But nothing of the kind basically happened, and nothing could basically happen. That is why we found ourselves in such a difficult situation. And what I said now, I believe I could afford saying at such high level. I thank you very much for your attention, and should you have any questions, I shall be ready to answer.
Thank you very much for your expose. I must admit that I agree with your analysis to a large extent on how you assess and analyze the current state of affairs, the political situation in Ukraine, which is one of the obstacles in fully engaging in realizing the Minsk agreements. You mentioned the sanctions factor, and I must here cite my minister Sergei Lavrov, who said at an earlier stage, back in the time when Poroshenko was president of Ukraine, he said that that's a paradox. Poroshenko and Kyiv do not implement Minsk agreements, but Russia is being sanctioned for that, and that's the gist of what you exactly said. Indeed, the roadmap to implement the Minsk agreements, which is a purpose and a name of the Minsk Contact Group. We know that Ukrainian side presented its roadmap, that the region has presented its roadmap. They are not complementing, so to say. But the other thing is, as we know, that the Ukrainian side refuses to discuss the roadmap presented by the republics, asking instead that the Russian Federation should provide one, which we refuse to do for obvious reasons. Now you mentioned the role of the Normandy participants, in particular France and Germany. I already commented on that in my introductory remarks, but I wanted to add to that two things. First, I say often when we discuss Ukraine in official meetings of the Security Council, which happens from time to time, that there is one phenomenon which I call lost in translation, which means that not just Germany and France, but other countries, but Germany and France in particular, they do not understand completely the genesis of the Ukrainian crisis. On the one hand, because they, whether you want it, whether you're not, however intelligent they are, but they are outsiders to this conflict. They do not understand the things, delicate things that that are obvious both to Ukrainians, whether they admit it or not, or to the representatives of Donbas, or to the Russians. Unfortunately, they are deprived of that being able to immerse into the translation. And of course, the other factor is ideological and then political, which is Russia itself, which is another factor. Now, according to the logic of today's meeting, I should be giving the floor now to the participants of the normative formats, to France and Germany, who also chose to ignore the meeting, like those who they convinced to follow suit. But that, on the other hand, gives us a benefit to engage more in a dialogue with the participants, with the briefers today. And I would take a liberty upon myself to ask questions to all of you. And I think that by picking up these questions, I would, one way or the other, I would reflect the narrative that would follow today were the countries that chose to ignore present at that meeting. And the first question, I'm pretty sure that they would ask, in particular the republics, where do you hide the Russian troops? Where are they? How did they participate in the conflict? Because that's the narrative that we hear all the time, that it's not the Donbas population, but it's the Russian voluntaries, but in fact Russian troops who are in fact engaged in military warfare. Secondly, I think they would ask you what Russia is doing to assist Donbas. They would claim that you are effectively governed by the Russian Federation. That you are, as I said, puppets. You are not representing the people of Donbas, but you are representing actually Russian Federation. I think that I would leave it at here. I have more questions, and I of course would welcome questions from the participants if they have any. But maybe I'll stop at that and ask you to answer these two first ones, and then I will pose additional questions. Who is volunteering to start? Natalia?
Да, Василий Алексеевич, могу ответить и я.
Yes, Ambassador, I could indeed answer. And indeed, we quite often hear those questions, for example, in interviews from journalists. The Ukrainian delegations already stopped asking such questions during the negotiations because they have received a very clear answer several times. First of all, let me remind that at the Security Council meeting, this question coming from the Ukrainian representative was addressed to Mr. Apekan, who back then was coordinator in the negotiations process on security issues. The permanent representative of Ukraine asked this question to Mr. Apekan, and Mr. Apekan gave a very direct answer. He said he did not see and he could not register presence of Russian troops in Donbas. Frankly speaking, to us, this question sounds a little bit laughable, because apparently we hide this powerful army in such a professional way that no one is able to see it. if those people really asked us this question, we would ask them in return, are you being serious? Our rebels are armed with AK-47 that we could get from the military garrisons that transferred to our side, that we won at the battlefield, that were our trophies from the Ukrainian armed forces. It might sound a little bit funny, but this is also armaments that we took from our great patriotic war museums. Some of those armaments were disassembled in order for us to assemble the arms. I'm not a large connoisseur of modern weapons, but I'm deeply convinced that the armed forces of the Russian Federation definitely would not use the weapons and the guns that Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics forces have now. I think if the Russian Federation really was an aggressor to Ukraine, I think Kiev would not resist to such aggression for a long time. But if we stop joking and start talking serious, the Security Council of the United Nations is the only institution that can define the presence of aggression. And it was the Security Council that endorsed the package of measures by its resolution, the document that prescribed the two sides of the conflict, Kiev and Donbass, to have dialogue. So the answer to your first question, we do not hide anyone. Our forces are at the borders of our republics, which unfortunately are quite in the middle of those republics, because we think the republic is the whole territory where the referendum was held. As for the help of the Russian Federation, there is a lot of help. First of all, its decree about the recognition of our documents, because without this decree, our population would be absolutely limited in its rights, because the blockade that Ukraine introduced against the republics put 4.5 million people on the brink of survival. All our basic rights, the right of freedom of movement was violated, the right to choose the place of living, the right to social services, the right to safe living conditions, all those were infringed. So thanks to such humanitarian steps, humanitarian decrees of the Russian Federation, we could survive. And we will not stop thanking Russia for the humanitarian convoys that in 2014, 2015 allowed the population of Donbass to get by. Without those foods, it would have been extremely hard for us. No one had expected that there would be such a conflict, that Ukraine would dispatch its troops against us, and that we would have to survive and take such decisions. At the very beginning, let me be frank, we were not even ready to the fact that we will have to think of the food for our population, that we would have to think where to have food for them. So those white trucks really saved lots of people, and we will not stop thanking Russia for that. I might add another point. It is their help as mediators in the negotiation process, because without the representatives of Russia, the representatives of Ukraine would be even more outrageous during the negotiations. Ukraine still shows its total unwillingness to see facts, to listen to engage in dialogue with the representatives of Donbas. What also can be called help of Russia is their position that the point of view of Donbas must be heard. So we are thankful for that once again.
We have requests for the floor, and I would like to give the floor first to the representative of Belarus as a country that hosts Minsk talks. And this is a venue of the Contact Minsk group. Belarus, I don't see you on the screen. Artem, you are there?
Dear Chairman, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, of course.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, dear Chairman. We first of all appreciate your efforts for convening this meeting today. It is indeed a good opportunity for us all to hear the situation from the ground, which is not quite often situation here in New York. So we are fully thankful to the delegation of the Russian Federation. My statement would be rather of a general nature. First of all, outlining the role of the Republic of Belarus in facilitating the negotiations process. And first of all, and most important, we would like to say that Belarus stands in favor of the achievement of peace and stability in the regions of Ukraine. And we cannot be indifferent to the developments taking place in the neighboring brotherly country of Ukraine, and peaceful settlements of the conflict, as it was already mentioned, is an imperative. It is not subject to any doubt. And we consider that the compliance by the parties with the Minsk agreements remains the only effective basis for resolving the crisis. I fully share the positions of the previous speakers that Minsk agreements remain the most important pillar for continuing the peaceful process. And of course, we welcome the convening of the Paris Normandy summit last year, which has been 1 year since then. And it is our strong belief that the outcomes of the summit will continue to facilitate the negotiations. And we call on all the parties involved to abide by the results of the Normandy summit. It was mentioned that not all of the agreements of this event are observed right now. So we call on all the involved countries to follow these results. We are proud to say, and we usually pay much attention to that Belarus has been consistently supporting the process of peaceful settlements in the conflict of Ukraine. We stand ready to continue moving towards this goal. Our contribution to a comprehensive dialogue is evident. The meetings of the trilateral contact group on Ukraine and its working subgroups have been regularly taking place in Minsk. And if we take different platforms, we also know that there is an important role of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission, which the representatives of Belarus are taking active part in. And so let me once again reiterate that Belarus is committed to continue to provide, of course, together with all the partners, all necessary assistance to restore peace in Ukraine based on dialogue and mutual respect. This is the most important prerequisite for achieving peace and security. I repeat, dialogue and mutual respect. So we are ready to facilitate negotiations in Minsk at any level and in any format, especially considering the current challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I thank Belarus for its statement. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the People's Republic of China.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for calling this meeting. I listened carefully to the remarks of the previous speakers. Since the outbreak of the Ukrainian crisis, China has maintained an objective and impartial position. We respect the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine, and oppose the interference in Ukraine's internal affairs by any external forces. There is no military solution to the crisis, and the dialogue and negotiation are the only way out. As the key to the political mediation of Ukrainian crisis, Minsk II agreement remains the greatest common denominator of all parties. Last year, the summit of Normandy 4 was successfully restarted, and an important consensus were reached on the implementation of the Minsk II agreement. We call on relevant parties to implement the agreement concretely, to remain committed to the overall direction of a political settlement, and to seek a comprehensive solution to the crisis through dialogue and consultation. It's our hope that such a comprehensive solution will facilitate the realization of peace, stability, and development in Ukraine, and promote the harmony among all ethnicities in this country and its peaceful coexistence with regional countries. China will continue to play a constructive role for the political resolution of the Ukrainian crisis. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank China for its statement, and now I'd like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to highlight the following points. First, Indonesia has always been consistent in upholding and respecting the principles of non-interference, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of all countries, including Ukraine. Indonesia is, therefore, against any actions of annexation and illegal territorial occupation of any sovereign country or territory. Act of separatism should not be tolerated. Second, Indonesia wishes to reiterate its support towards the full implementation of various relevant agreements by all parties, including the Minsk agreements and the package of measures, which has been endorsed by the UNSC Resolution 2022-02. Third, any diplomatic efforts and political settlements should be geared toward achieving a lasting peace. The debate on Ukrainian issues here in the UN should have the objective to encourage all parties to take necessary measures to reduce tensions, exercise maximum restraint, and to promote peaceful settlement, and not to cause controversy and further exacerbate the situation. I thank you.
I thank Indonesia for its statement. Maybe if you allow me, I would like to pose a couple of questions to Mr. Denego. First, do you still maintain economic and cultural relations with the, so to say, mainland Ukraine? Secondly, Russia is being criticized by Ukraine and the Western countries for issuing Russian passports to the population of Donbas. What can you say about this? And thirdly, how do you see? We know that, as Mikhail said, the nationalist element, the passionate part of the Ukrainian society that control the streets. We know that the nationalistic moods in Ukraine are high today, at least among the part of the population, even them being a minority. How this new historical paradigm, so to say, that the Ukrainian authorities are trying to introduce into the political narrative, how does it affect the settlement?
Спасибо большое за
Thank
вопросы.
you so much for your questions. Those are indeed very important ones. Well, first of all, on those relations that we uphold right now, as you said, the mainland Ukraine. The economic cooperation was blocked by the Ukrainian side, and we're trying somehow to raise those questions during Minsk negotiations. We have used the opportunity when Zelensky was just going for president. One of the theses of his election programs was the restoration of the social economic ties. And we've used this thesis of his election program and tried to offer the Ukrainian side to discuss this topic. Even more so that the paragraph 8 of the package of measures has this as one of its primary goals. And we were surprised that Ukraine, apart from its motto of restoring the economic ties, did not have anything in reality, not when it comes to their negotiation stand, not in real life. In our attempts to offer some sort of roadmap on restoring the social economic ties, it just hangs in the air because Ukraine refuses to discuss this issue, even though this topic is constantly on the agenda, on the subgroup of the issues of economic settlement. And the task of the subgroup that in the framework of the contact group is working on this block of issues is, first of all, to implement the social and economic part of the package of measures. But unfortunately, we do not see any progress on the part of Ukraine in this area, and even attempts to discuss this issue with Ukraine are blocked by Ukraine. Cultural ties, well, if we talk about some cultural ties, we can talk about this for the simple reason that Ukraine, for example, declared the establishment of alternatives, so to say, theaters of themes that existed in the city of Luhansk. For example, we have the Ukrainian musical and dramatic theater that for the rather long time was working, but Ukraine denies its existence as such. Speaking about direct ties, on the official level, Ukraine blocks those possibilities. But speaking about direct ties, here the situation is a bit different. We have a program that is being implemented, a targeted program for the restoration of the unity of people on both sides of the limitation line. And under this program, there's a cultural block that allows us now to give an opportunity to the people on the other side of the line, on the other side of the limitation line. It gives them an opportunity to have access to the traditions of the Luhansk culture that were in high demand pretty much all the time. So they visit our theaters, they go to the circus that throughout the whole time of the existence of Ukraine pretty much did not exist. There was just the building. But after all the events, we've reconstructed the circus and it started working. It gives performances, and people from the other side of the line, they have an opportunity to visit the performances. They can take part in the sports competitions and sports events that take place here. And on top of all that, all these lines of cooperation and interaction, engagement with the people who live on the other side of the line, they are financed from the budget. Moreover, we have a number of cultural events, for example, photo competitions that people that live on the other side of the line can take part in. And they not only take an active part, but they are also awarded. They get prizes and bonuses. And often the award winners are our citizens that so far live on the territory that is controlled by Kiev. I can go on and on about this topic, but I shouldn't abuse this opportunity, although I'd like to say a lot. Let me pass to the second question that you asked about the criticism from Ukraine and Western countries of the efforts of the Russian Federation that through certain humanitarian steps is trying to make the life of the people on the territory of unrecognized republics easier. The issue with the passport arose pretty much straight after the conflict arose. Many people simply had their Ukrainian passports expired. And in order to extend the passports, to renew them, to put new photos, it's technically impossible from the moment when Ukraine withdrew all of the corresponding official bodies that perform those functions and services for the people who lived here. Also, life moves on. People marry, people are being born, and those people, they are pretty much undocumented. They don't have the documents that they need on a daily basis. As for now, children that were born on the territory of the unrecognized territorial of the republics, they also already go to school, and they at least need the certificate of birth. And once they reach a certain age, they need to get a passport. And those people who got married, they need a certificate of marriage and to replace passports. And at the initial stage, we were forced to introduce our own passport documents to give those people an opportunity to exercise their civil rights. And for us, it was very important. We appreciated the step of the Russian Federation when Russia recognized those documents of the territory of the Russian Federation. It was a very serious humanitarian task that Russian Federation implemented towards the people of Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. The next step is issuing passports of the Russian Federation and facilitated procedure of obtaining Russian citizenship, and it also turned out to be in demand because people have been waiting for such a step. And let's say this gesture of the Russian Federation, it gave hope to the people that they're not forgotten, and that Russia is actually paying attention to their situation. So for people who live here, it's a very important step. And the people who live under shelling every day, who live against the backdrop of economic and the whole range of other embargoes, they're especially grateful to such steps that are being made towards them. And this is very important for our people. And the criticism that comes from Ukraine, in this case, it only makes it more clear for the people about the real state of affairs. Those people who, because of the actions of Ukraine, because Ukraine stopped providing the services as a state for this group of people, they were left undocumented. And right now, Ukraine, you see, insists that those people should stay undocumented. It does not recognize that those people have civil rights. And this clearly states the attitude of the current authorities in Kiev towards those people. And of course, those people draw their own conclusions, and obviously not in favor of those who criticize such attitude of the Russian Federation towards us. Speaking about the third issue, the nationalistic groups that indeed pose some challenges for Ukraine in the part of the implementation of the obligations taken in Minsk, but also in everyday life, of course, is a reality. We saw some manifestations of such activity in Odessa in May 2014, where such nationalistic communities were burning people who were voicing thoughts different than being imposed by those groups towards the whole Ukrainian society. They were taking steps to block the possibility to amend the constitution of Ukraine. On the 31st of August 2015, Ukraine attempted to implement decentralization, what they understood as decentralization. And unfortunately, it was unilaterally done without discussing the draft of the constitution amendments with the representatives of Donbas and the contact group, as it was prescribed by the Minsk agreements. But nevertheless, they tried to take the step. And on the 31st of August, those nationalistic, well, I don't know, NGOs is probably not right for a word for them, because they're armed. Armed groups, well, I cannot call like this because they are legal in Ukraine, but they nevertheless took steps towards aggressively using arms, stop this process at Rada, and they are behind the current authorities, and they stand behind them. They are armed, and at any moment they are ready to block any attempts of dialogue with the Donbas. And here it's hard to argue with this. But nevertheless, Ukraine has to decide whether it's a state or just a gathering of such nationalistic groups that dictates to the state what it should do. They should draw their conclusions. They should take the steps to restore their rule of law on their territory and move towards the implementation of the Minsk agreement if they intend to do so. But unfortunately, last years clearly show that Ukraine really depends on such nationalistic groups. It depends on those who really stand behind those nationalistic groups, who finances them and instigates them towards taking an active stance that do not allow Ukraine to implement Minsk agreements. But more likely, we should look even deeper. Ukraine indeed does not intend to implement its part of obligations within Minsk agreement, and mostly it's just sheltering by the nationalistic groups, saying that they're in difficult situation in order to justify the fact that they don't implement the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, I looked at all of those events through the Minsk agreements. It just so happened that I know the situation very well, and based on the statements of the representatives of China, Indonesia, I've heard that, for me, I've heard some notes that show that they do not probably fully understand the picture, and I'd like to, it would be nice to have an opportunity to discuss in more detail the process of a settlement and how the events developed, give them a perspective from the inside to explain to them what is going on in the Ukrainian politics and in the relations of Ukraine with Donbas and within the Minsk negotiations, how the events are unfolding and why it happens this way. So that's why I'd ask to consider a possibility to widen platform because the representatives of the countries who are members of the UN security members clearly have the interests, but I have this hunger, I see this lack of information that impedes for them to understand the situation clearly. And I'd like to use this platform to open probably this topic and this internal kitchen of the negotiation process, and to show these contradictions that indeed don't allow this process to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there is a lack of information indeed, but today's meeting is exactly the purpose of it is to provide this information firsthand, and we appreciate that those countries that came to participate today to learn from those who can provide you information from the ground. I wanted to ask another question to Mr. Pogrebinski, but I see Natalia is raising her hand. And ladies first, let her speak out.
Благодарю вас, Василий Алексеевич.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. And Vladislav gave a lot of detail in his answers. And I'd like to be brief and give a personal example to the questions in response to the question you asked. So, for example, I'm an authorized representative in the Minsk negotiation. I have the passport of the citizen of Ukraine, but the passport is not valid as of now because it expired around a year ago, a little bit less. And in order to fly to Minsk for the negotiations, I have no document that would allow me to take part in this process. And I don't have a possibility to get a new Ukrainian document because Ukraine withdrew from its territory all the state bodies and it blocked the border. And once again, Ukraine persecutes all of the participants of the events. And only thanks to the fact that the Russian Federation issues through a facilitated procedure the passports of the citizens of Russian Federation, I was able to get this document and to continue taking part in the peaceful negotiation process. Otherwise, I would be deprived of this right because in order to get to the Republic of Belarus, to get to Minsk and take part in the negotiation, I need a document to cross two borders, the border between Donetsk People Republic and Russian Federation, and then from Russian Federation to the Republic of Belarus. It's a simple example that demonstrates that without this solution, humanitarian step on issuing the passports of the Russian Federation through a facilitated procedure, we'd be just completely limited in our movement on all sides. This is just a brief but very clear example that illustrates of what is really going on, and my personal example as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed, this is a clear example. I said that there are countries that came here to learn, but there are other countries that chose not to come here and not to learn. And I referred to it many times. I will come back to it when I speak at the end of our meeting. Now I fully understand and recognize the wish by Mr. Pogrebinski to see Donbass reintegrated. That was a region and is a region of Ukraine that enjoyed life in one state before the conflict erupted. But the question is how to mend it, how to rectify. We see, and you will agree with me, that for whatever reasons, but there is no real willingness on the part of the Kiev authorities to talk to Donbass, and to take into account its interests and priorities. At the same time, we see from Kyiv quite often that Kyiv wants to embrace Donbass, and on the other hand, it says that Donbass will embrace Kyiv immediately after Kyiv restores the control over the territory. Well, I personally was saying to my colleagues, and I personally was not a witness of any mass-scale protests in Donbass against the de facto authorities, any registered human rights violations, for example. So I don't think that that Donbass population, as of today, is so much willing to reintegrate. That's sad, but that's unfortunately a fact of reality which we have to deal with. My question to you, Mikhail Borisovich, however difficult, I know that's not an easy question. What do you think Ukrainian authorities should do to maintain Donetsk and Lugansk in the composition of Ukraine and to reintegrate that region back? Михаил Борисович, микрофон включите, пожалуйста.
Please turn on the mic. Thank you. Can you hear me? It's a very good question. And I can only say that I do not have a full answer, detailed answer to this question, taking into account the authorities we have right now. But if you want to hear what would be right, in my opinion, I would say that there is a principled positions of the Minsk agreements that cannot be changed. For example, ones that guarantees the safety to the people who live in certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk region. This guarantee can be only obtained in the order that is provided by the Steinmeier formula, and the Ukrainian authorities agreed to that. There are paragraphs that through some protocols can be agreed, additionally agreed, so that the parties would understand which way each party should take to agree and to reach compromise about the amnesty, for example. In the text of the package of measures, there's no detailed information on this topic, and this is a reason for disagreements. But I think that there is a way to find a mutually accepted solution, but this certain protocol should be prepared for that, who would give a detailed information on how and what way the compromise can be reached. Now, on the issue on holding the elections in the territory of Donbass, I can say there's no way of direct implementation.
I do not see an opportunity to directly implement this idea. The Kyiv's position is that lay down your arms. All those who are armed constitute illegal armed formations, so they have to lay down their arms. Then the border issue, then elections. Steinmeier formula envisages another succession. But the question is how to convene the elections so that all sides recognize them as effective. It takes compromise. The sides need a specialized protocol, a specialized draft law on the package of measures that has to be voted in Verkhovnaya Rada. Besides, there are things that Verkhovnaya Rada has already voted on, and those are categorical positions that run counter both to the letter and spirit of the Minsk agreements. Is there an opportunity to take a step back? Of course there is, but this should be a step that would be mutually agreed with the special areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, I do not see any specific problems. It only takes political will to follow this path. Let me give you an example of double standards. We know that there is a Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, which is recognized by no one but Turkey. There are Turkish troops in there. There are elections organized there on a regular basis. I must say that people who win the elections there are recognized by European and global community as representatives of Turkish community. Those countries do not recognize this state, but some international institutions, this Turkish Republic has its observers. For example, in the League of Arab States, if I'm not mistaken, and in some other organizations. This is obviously accepted by the global community, but when it comes to the representatives elected in Donetsk and Luhansk, they are not recognized as the representatives of this commune. It is not about recognizing their statehood, it is about recognizing them as representatives of their community. I understand why our leaders have this position, because as soon as we recognize that these people represent a community that lives in there, they will be the opponents in the negotiation process, which is an opportunity to walk the way of peaceful settlement, because it is always good to talk to real people representing the local community. But then the format of the crisis will change. The crisis will cease to be international, so to speak, between Russia and Ukraine. It will be internal Ukrainian conflict. And this is something that Ukrainian authorities are not okay with. And I would say that our Western friends are not okay with this. They would like to preserve the format that exists today in order to have an opportunity to strategically deter Russia, the way they call it. I hope this is a temporary state of affairs, and as soon as there is a chance to find a reasonable compromise between Europe and Russia, between Washington and Russia, there will be another interpretation of this conflict, which can give an impetus to serious and long-term settlement of the conflict in the east of Ukraine.
Difficult to add anything to it, in particular to the latter part of what Mikhail Borisovich was saying. Well, that's obvious to us as well, but unfortunately, the reality is a little bit different. And indeed, the way how we define the conflict, that is perhaps the main stumbling block on the progress towards the settlement. Besides our friends and partners in the West, I think that Ukraine also benefits, at least partly, maybe not even partly, from defining this conflict as an interstate conflict rather than domestic one. Domestic conflict, if qualified this way, it entails so many consequences: political, moral, cultural, economic, whatever, that for the time being, at least, it is much more easier to hide behind the qualification of this conflict as a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Well, by de facto, this conflict became a political conflict between Russia and Ukraine. But the authorities, of course, they go beyond that. For them, it's not so important that it's a political conflict, which is a factor and a derivative from from the whole situation. But to brand it as a military conflict, first of all, and from that many things, most of the things proceed. Now, my intention is to give the floor to the briefers for their statements in the end of our meeting, whatever they want to say after they've been speaking, hearing, and responding to questions. We, of course, will continue this practice, and we earnestly hope that next time we'll be joined by those who have to say their own truth as they deem it right, because we do not write scenarios for these meetings. We do not indoctrinate people what to say. We are for the open and frank dialogue and exchange of opinions. Only that frank and direct exchange of opinions can bring better understanding of where we are and where we should be moving. And I will start with Natalia. Natalia with her wrap up of today's meeting.
Благодарю вас, Василий Алексеевич.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me once again express our gratitude for an opportunity to present our vision and to give the information as we see it, as the second side of the conflict, Donbas and Republic sees it. Let me get back a little bit to the previous statements. The word occupation is very harsh on one's ear. The phrase occupied territories is also harsh to hear. Indeed, Ukrainian authorities often use this term that here in the republics we are clueless as to whom we are occupied by. I'm a Donetsk native. Is it me who occupied the city of Donetsk? It's kind of strange. I have many compatriots here. They're all here. Can you occupy your own home? We think you cannot. Besides, the Minsk agreements do not contain such terminology, so we would very much encourage the global community to be very cautious when using those terms. I would like to agree with Mr. Pogrebinsky that there are some draft laws, some voted legal acts, the acts that Verkhovna Rada has voted with, that have never been negotiated in the Minsk negotiation process as it is prescribed by the package of measures. Today we raised a number of factors, a number of details about the real state of affairs and about what is going on in the Minsk negotiation process. Quite unexpectedly, we received support from Kyiv, from Mr. Pogrebinsky. It all proves that Ukraine does not intend to have negotiations with Donbas. It does not intend to meet its international obligations as per the package of measures that has been endorsed by a Security Council resolution. Kyiv is not going to listen to us, to observe our rights, to take on board our opinion. It is clear for us now. Over the 7 years of de facto war waged by Ukraine against the people of Donbas, our own hopes and aspirations regarding prospects of Minsk negotiation process have changed. I mean, those initial aspirations that we had back in 2014, 2015. We greatly respect the international law and our own obligations under the package of measures. That is why we continue to work actively by proposing new ideas on how to implement this document, on how to follow the peaceful path we have put forward, our roadmap, our plan of action. And should you like to study it, you will hardly find any discrepancy in it with the package of measures because the plan is aimed to implement the package. However, we do not hear any reaction coming from the Ukrainian side. At this point, I'd like to support my colleague, Mr. Denego, that it is getting harder and harder for us to respond to the questions posed by the people of Donbas, who ask us with fear and anticipation after every round of Minsk negotiations, is Ukraine likely to get back here? Are nationalist battalions and armed formation of Ukraine security forces likely to get back here? Those who tortured our children, who killed people, who sabotaged the water station that supplied water to the entire Donbas. Will they get back in here? Will you give up the border to them? And it is getting more and more complicated for us with every decision of theirs, with the draft law on internment, with every other shot they take. It is getting harder and harder for us to answer those questions and to look in the eyes of our people, seeing fear of Ukraine and of Ukrainian enforcement authorities in their eyes. Taking into account the fact that Ukraine in the negotiation process refuses to actually negotiate, at least to listen to the part of opinion of Donbas, I think everybody knows the expression that it is only one time that a state shoots at its own people. Only the first shot is at its own people. Every other shot is at the people that is not their own anymore. Here comes a question that we would like to put to the members of Security Council who are present here at this meeting. We understand that as of today, the package of measures is the only mechanism to settle the conflict that has no alternative, but probably over the 7 years, taking into account the unwillingness and de facto refusal of Ukraine to implement this document, probably we should engage direct democracy mechanisms and ask the people of Donbas what they want. We are ready to convene in accordance with all international principles of this act of determination. We are ready to comply with all the conditions so that the results of this referendum are recognized. We are ready to facilitate access of any international global observers, no matter how many of them there might be, but we want the voice of the people of Donbas to be heard. This is 4.5 million people who have been living under fire for 7 years, who have been ignored for 7 years. Once again, we would like to thank you for this meeting and for an opportunity for us to present our position. Let me repeat that we remain committed to our international obligations and we will be implementing the documents that have been endorsed by the Security Council. But in fact, Ukraine is only one step away from withdrawing from those negotiations. So we think it's time we implemented Article 1 of the UN Charter. We stand ready for that and we call upon you not to let a disaster happen and to act in a preventive mode. Thank you for your attention.
Спасибо, Василий Алексеевич.
Thank you, Ambassador. After those words of Ms. Nikonova, I do not feel like saying anything else. She said the most important words in the end of your speech. I would like to thank you for an opportunity to raise our problems at such a high level. And let me also call on all the participants of this meeting and all other countries to try to address the issue in a targeted mode and draw the right conclusions. We would like to invite to us everyone who might find it possible. Mr. Pogrebinsky in the first place, I think. Would like to invite them to come to us, see what is happening here, talk to people, get a better knowledge of the situation, and understand the state of affairs in Donbas from inside. And getting back to what Ms. Nikonorova said, I subscribe to everything she said, everything she stressed at the end of her statement. I thank you.
Thank you, Vladislav Nikolaevich. Well, I think that your invitation to Mr. Pogrebinsky, he will comment himself, but I think that it would be more useful and conducive for the Ukrainian settlement if you invited President Zelensky and he would come and see himself what's happening on Donbas. Mikhail Borisovich, пожалуйста.
Yes, it would indeed be good to invite President Zelensky to Donbas because he mostly visits the contact line. What I would like to add is the following. I'm not that optimistic, but I believe the idea of coming up with a roadmap is a promising one. And when I found out that the roadmap prepared by certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions contains a principal compromise position that does not exist in the package of measures. The package of measures envisages special status for those territories forever enshrined in the constitution. The roadmap of certain areas stipulates some period, I'm not sure as to how many years, but this is a concession which demonstrates readiness for compromise. Thus, Ukrainian leadership has an opportunity to offer a compromise on their side. The roadmap that Mr. Kravchuk proposed on our side does not contain such an obvious proposal. At least I didn't see any. But the reaction to what has happened shows that probably the next step, forgive me if I look too optimistic now, but I'm always inclined to think that common sense has to include an obvious thing. Russia recognizes Donbass as part of Ukraine and so on. And I think we need to look for an opportunity to implement the principle of territorial integrity, but this is possible only when people residing in the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk have their safety guaranteed, and that when they understand that they are getting back to a country where they will feel good, where their children will have an opportunity to get educated in their native language, where their human rights will be upheld, where they will have an opportunity and access to education, to healthcare, and so on. Now, the situation is very hard. It is also very hard in Ukraine itself, and in these circumstances, it would be very good if sides demonstrated mutual willingness to make steps forward each other. So the words of a famous cartoon character asked to be pronounced at the end of this meeting. Let me remind that a year after the Paris summit that decided to convene a range of steps, and over this year, some of those steps were implemented, but there is the second part of the Paris summit that foresees implementation of Steinmeier formula, in the Ukrainian legislation. And steps in this direction would be steps towards compromise, steps towards settlement of the conflict in the east of Ukraine. Let me thank you again. Hopefully this event will reconvene at some point, probably in another context.
This gathering in this meeting knows who Cat Leopold is. I will explain that Cat Leopold is a Soviet cartoon character, the one that called for living friendly with everyone. That was his motive. He was saying to everyone, let's be friendly. And well, I fully support it. And you doubted you were whether you had to be an optimist. I think that we all have to be optimists. Whatever happened and whatever happens, we still need to be optimistic and believe that we will be able to reach the settlement and to adhere to aspirations of all who participate in it. And I believe that today the members of the Security Council and those who joined them, other delegations, participated in a very important meeting. We listened to the positions of representative of Donbas and politologists from Kiev, and positions of representatives of Donbas. Unfortunately, are usually, not even often, but usually muted and seriously distorted. And this meeting was not about promoting separatism as our official Ukrainian and Western colleagues will most likely label it. We gathered today to review the implementation of Minsk agreements with the assistance of those who are most interested in the success of this process. And I would like to stress once again, I think it was a consensus among all who spoke at this meeting that these agreements endorsed by UN Security Council resolution at present and at this moment have no alternative. They are the only means to come to a settlement eventually. We repeatedly refuted Ukrainian allegations, official Ukrainian allegations, echoed by some Western countries that Russia, I quote, violates Minsk agreements. Today, you heard first-hand information about this issue, which is much more valuable than any allegations. That is exactly the reason why Kiev, supported by Berlin and Paris, did everything to prevent this meeting from happening and finally ignored participating in it. Because truth hurts, unfortunately. And what we heard today is very uncomfortable for our Ukrainian and Western colleagues. They simply have nothing to say against this truth. Instead, they create a smokescreen, masking their inability to engage in meaningful discussion. We regret this. We want to see our Ukrainian neighbors sane and prosperous. Instead, we see, instead of Ukraine we once knew and loved, a sort of anti-Russia, ignoring realities, turning their fear to what Russian-speaking population in particular, and in particular in the east of the country wants. Today's meeting clearly demonstrated that this extremely harmful trend for Ukraine itself persists. It is very discouraged, but we will not abandon our efforts to make Ukraine honor its obligations and implement what had been agreed. There is no simply any other way to solve this inter-Ukrainian crisis. Dialogue is also indispensable for the same, and we will be actively encouraging Kyiv to engage in dialogue with its own people. We all should understand that there is only one alternative to this, which I even wouldn't dare pronounce, but I have to. The alternative to this is war, which we would like to avoid at any cost. And this is not an exaggeration, but this is a gruesome reality. Let's not forget about it. We thank our today's briefers and consider everything that was said today by them extremely important. Therefore, we think that this meeting was very useful and we are very satisfied that it took place. We thank those delegations that chose to participate in it and those who chose to boycott it, have exposed themselves and have clearly taken side in this civil Ukrainian conflict instead of trying to be unbiased intermediaries. We will, of course, take due note of that. But for one thing, I have to thank them, those who were absent today. We all benefited from their absence in a sense that our briefers, our briefers were able to speak out more at this meeting. Once again, thank you very much. All the best to you. We will follow up on this and we'll find other ways how to engage in a similar discussion. Thank you and goodbye.
Этот компьютер администратор.